toppled this year, or will Russia annex Belarus? What do military exercises near Ukraine's borders in Belarus really mean? We talked to Pavel Latushko, deputy head of the Transition Cabinet of Belarus. Greetings. I'll start by predicting that the Lukashenko regime may be toppled this year, as Putin will have no time to save him, and the Belarusians may gain their freedom.
Что режим Лукашенко может быть свергнут, так как Путину будет не до того, чтобы спасать Лукашенко, поэтому белорусы могут получить, скажем так, свободу от диктатора.
Do you think there is any basis for this prediction? What or who can become this black swan? Or will Lukashenko still remain president until 2030?
Останется, к сожалению, президентом, так называемым, самопровозглашенным и до 2030 года.
Interestingly, it is Lukashenko and Russia that are trying to sway the situation in Belarus before the elections. These are not only public statements, but also actions aimed at creating irritation and discontent in the society in order to create negative feelings towards the dictator and the repressive system. A few weeks ago, there was information about the preparation of a coup d'etat in Belarus. The coup d'etat and armed uprising will allegedly take place on January 24th to 25th, the day before Lukashenko attempts to reappoint himself president. The information began to be spread by Russians, in particular the Telegram channel Welders and military expert Deepening. Zakharova said that the U.S. State Department was preparing a coup in Belarus. They are also trying to include the armed forces of Ukraine, which will enter the territory of Russia through Belarus. Kalinowski's regiment is attributed to Poland, and the Belarusian opposition is at the head of everything. This information is being spread, and then they scream that the Russians will send troops if anything happens. Yesterday, Assistant Defense Minister Kremlin and his deputy Revenko said that the fugitives were planning armed training abroad and provocations in Belarus. On or around Election Day. General Revenko from now on bears personal responsibility for possible provocations in Belarus. Before every election campaign, Lukashenko's special services claim that the opposition is preparing some kind of coup to overthrow Lukashenko.
Какой-то переворот, какие-то силовые столкновения, будет там, не знаю, крыс травить, еще что-то осуществлять для того, чтобы свергнуть Лукашенко.
And Revenko is doing it. We can conclude that Lukashenko's special services are preparing provocations on the 24th, 25th, or 26th. Lukashenko's special services go to apartments, especially rented apartments, and check the tenants. They are afraid that non-permanent residents will come to Minsk and other cities to organize riots. Preventive detentions are going on. Detentions in Belarus do not stop every day. Lukashenko informationally prepares the situation, and through detentions and repressions, compresses the spring against Belarusians. At least we're not planning a coup d'etat. We will fight and will not let Lukashenko's regime rest. If there are provocations, Lukashenko will be responsible for it. Repressions and provocations are aimed at ensuring a quiet election for Lukashenko. This seems to be what Lukashenko is trying to accomplish. Most of the activists, unfortunately, had to leave the country, even though they could have participated in the protests. The opposition is either locked up in prisons or has been forced to leave. There is no real pro-democratic candidate in the elections. Is there hope for Western intervention, supporting, for example, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, or will she not get real support?
Поддержать, возможно, демократического кандидата, ну, например, Светлану Тихановскую, или же она не будет сейчас иметь реальной поддержки.
There are no Democratic candidates at all, and there can't be any. Signature gathering is now complete. Nobody collected signatures. This is a special operation to organize Lukashenko's reappointment to the usurped position. The KGB identified a list of 4 fake candidates, Lukashenko's partners. They went to this election and are campaigning for Lukashenko. The campaign is unique in that these candidates are campaigning for Lukashenko despite their candidacy. We urge you to vote for him. Lukashenko did not allow anyone to go to the polls. This time, Lukashenko is not even trying to create an illusion that something in Belarus corresponds to the word elections. Thousands of people in prison. Babariko was shown, thank God he's alive, but he's been sentenced to 14 years in prison. He's been in for almost 2 years, and all independent media has been eliminated. All opposition parties, 1,700 NGOs, over 50%, atmosphere of fear, daily detentions and arrests. What kind of election can we talk about? The West in 2020 should have acted quickly, clearly, and firmly, but it did not. Western democracies don't function that way. As long as the dictator takes 100 steps, the Democrats will hang on the first step. Ukraine also has experience with democratic countries. We support democracy, but realize that dictators and totalitarian systems make decisions faster and more efficiently. They can talk about not recognizing the election. There are public statements. The European Parliament is preparing a statement of non-recognition of the elections. The Polish Senate Marshal said last week, in a meeting with Tishanovska, that they would not recognize this election. The head of Poland's Sejm parliament said he did not recognize as elections. On the 22nd, both houses of the Polish parliament are scheduled to declare their non-recognition of the elections. Head of Lithuanian parliament made statement. We hope that Estonia and Latvia will also do so, and we appeal to the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine with a demand not to recognize Lukashenko as president. He zeroed it out in 2020, and there is no reason to reinstate it. It is about maintaining the status quo and fighting to change Lukashenko's regime as long as he remains in power. The security threat to Ukraine and Europe persists, and human rights are not respected in Belarus. So this task is on the agenda, and we are working to make it happen. The Belarusian self-proclaimed president is probably lying when he says he's ready to hand over the position to a new generation during the Christmas holiday. I wonder if he was talking about his son or just being sarcastic. Knowing Lukashenko, I believe that he plays with these words, trying to convince Belarusians. 5 more years. Last time, the country was going to be broken up. Before that, it was going to be a war. Even before that, the economy was going to collapse. I'm the only one who can save this situation. He once said that there are no other candidates in Belarus. The head of the administration praises the representatives of different areas, each for their own merit. Since there is no united opinion on positive qualities, that leaves just me. It's a psychological, informational ploy. I'm going to take that transit. We are preparing a generational shift. He's signaling to the elite. In 2020, crawling to Putin in Sochi, he was told to leave for transit. He created the All Belarusian People's Assembly as an element of transit. He usurped two positions, president and chairman of the All Belarusian People's Assembly, which is, in fact, higher than the president. He has no executive leverage, but he has a fairly high position. So he has to explain to the elites. He created the All Belarusian People's Assembly. He has to explain to the Russians why he didn't go. But again, he's trying to make promises. I promise, generational change is coming soon, but give it another 5 years to correct. He's certainly thinking about Kolya. Unfortunately, that's a fact. He realistically thinks he can hand over power and the ideology of Lukashism to Kola. He has such dreams. But it's interesting that Lukashenko hasn't thought about his fate after Assad fled to Moscow.
Как-то не начал задумываться Лукашенко после смены режима, после того, как Башар Асад убежал в Москву, что его может ожидать такая же участь.
Maybe he changed his rhetoric after the drop in Russian support in Syria.
Скажем так, поддержки российской в Сирии.
After Assad's flight, Lukashenko said that the ally is reliable, but you have to count on yourself. He drew conclusions realizing that Putin was not responding to Assad. Putin did not order the military to protect Assad. Such a situation may catch up with him. Logistically, Russia is closer, the army is nearby, and there are military bases in Belarus. They are few in number, but they exist. It's a different story. Lukashenko realized that he could be screwed, like Assad. He realizes that the threats to the statehood of Belarus are real when he says that this issue should be excluded in the next 5 years. And who threatens the statehood of Belarus? Lukashenko's 30 years in power have led to a critical state for the sovereignty and independence of Belarus. It is not Poland, Lithuania, NATO, or the United States that is planning an attack on Belarus. They are interested in an independent Belarus, as is Ukraine. Then Belarus will not be a threat to the security of Ukraine, Poland, and Lithuania. Poland's interior minister said that the border crossings would not be opened until Lukashenko extradites the killers of the Polish soldier and stops the hybrid war. There is a permanent threat from Lukashenko. The main threat to Lukashenko is Russia. He probably doesn't sleep well because he has created a fifth column in Belarus. He has generals who go on vacations to RF. They have million-dollar accounts in Russian banks. 97% of Belarusians have been steadily expressing their desire to live in an independent state for the last 4 years. It is necessary to work with Belarusians to support their desire to live in an independent and democratic country oriented towards Europe. How, in your opinion, will the non-recognition of the elections affect the situation in Belarus if Lukashenko is going to win these elections? Isolation of Belarus will increase, and this may further deepen dependence on Russia. No one has driven the country more into dependence on Russia than Lukashenko. And Lukashenko is not a guarantor of Belarus's independence. Only the Belarusian people are the guarantor. If the Belarusian people want independence, they will provide it. Lukashenko will, die tomorrow. What guarantees does he give? Anyway, if he doesn't come back from the Emirates, he'll be there with gold bars. I don't know what's going to happen, but here he is gone. Who will guarantee independence? Therefore, it is pointless to invest in Lukashenko today. Investments should be made in the Belarusian society, which should be the guarantor of this independence. The civilian elites around Lukashenko have long been sleeping and seeing when he will be gone. Everyone is tired of living under constant pressure. I know the Prime Minister, Deputy Prime Ministers, and Chairman. They would love to say no, because they are in constant fear of being arrested, fired, and losing everything. He said to me, "Try going the wrong way. You can't even get a job as a janitor." They know the examples of politicians assassinated and the repression of those who opposed him. Therefore, the fear is enormous. They're starting to think differently. They don't want to live under the heel of Moscow, but there are bought generals like Karpenkov, Wolfowitz, and Ant. Yes, the positions are solid. The question is how officers and armed forces will react to their commands. It will be a challenge, and it is important how the civilian government will influence the generals. The main task of the transit period is to take power and hand it over to the people, not Moscow. Elites who do not support Lukashenko could try to topple his regime from within. Maybe they will try to poison him or make Lukashenko unable to remain president because of his health. There are no people in the elites who are capable of organizing themselves to do that. Processes happen in their heads. They see that he is having difficulty speaking and walking and realize that this moment is coming. They are already discussing it, perhaps in the forests or abroad, such as Turkey or the Emirates. That is, the process has already begun in their heads. There is talk that Lukashenko has made a deal with Putin for 300 Spartans. Lukashenko handed Putin a list of 300 top officials to guarantee their safety if he leaves power. Who can believe the Kremlin? Who can believe the Kremlin's guarantee that 300 officials, including the Prime Minister and ministers, will get security? I think it's the latter. What needed to be done? When the situation starts to falter, there will be no firmness and a split will occur. There was a split in 2020, especially in the Foreign Office. How many ambassadors, deputy foreign ministers have resigned? The former foreign minister was killed or poisoned under unclear circumstances. The German ambassador committed suicide. There's been a huge attrition there. The FCO has set an example, but it's not enough. 2020 has demonstrated that this is real. There was a split, but the number of people who went into power was not enough to turn the situation in favor of democracy and society. You have to work every day. Lukashenko will not allow to communicate with democratic forces in Belarusian society. He will only repress. Lukashenko is organizing provocations before the elections. For example, last week, Belarusian troops moved to 4 areas near the Ukrainian border.
Возвращаться к вопросу о провокациях, которые накануне выборов устраивает Лукашенко, мы слышали на прошлой неделе, что в 4 района Беларуси перебросили белорусские войска вблизи украинской границы.
Our border guards say the reservist exercises are not a threat to us. Kovalenko is convinced that these are provocations before the presidential election. Lukashenko is thus prepared. How do you view these signs? I think they need to be viewed in several aspects. On the one hand, it is an attempt to intimidate the public, to create tension, and show that an attack is possible. So he strengthens the armed forces to provide security. It's like making up a story about a war that didn't happen, but I'm still a hero because I was able to defeat the enemy. He didn't dare step on my turf because I pulled down the troops and showed my fist. That's how primitive it looks to Lukashenko. He says that Belarus is a besieged fortress, and thanks to his will, intelligence, diplomacy, and powerful army, we have prevented an attack. He made up a story and won it himself. On the other hand, this is an attempt to influence Ukraine and make money. Everything Lukashenko does at the border with Ukraine is an attempt to make money. This is his greedy and miserable business. This is a man who makes money from war by endangering Ukraine. He's getting a transmission from Moscow. And for that, Moscow pays him. It's costly to send in brigades and SWAT teams. Lukashenko has allocated 10% of the budget for defense this year. It will lead to economic collapse. If a country allocates 10% of its budget to GDP, it needs external support. The Russians come to the rescue and they pay him for it. You mentioned the army, and Belarus is ranked 70th, and the top 3 are the United States, Russia, and China. Ukraine has risen to 20th place among the most powerful armies in the world. This is a word about what Belarus can surprise us with if it continues military provocations. This is a word about what Belarus can surprise us with if it continues military provocations. Will Putin's promises remain just words, or will the Kremlin demand Belarus accession or its further integration with Russia? As for the information from Medusa about whether or not that the Kremlin views Belarus as a consolation prize. We warned our Western partners back in 2021 that the lack of support for our struggle could lead to the incorporation of Belarus by Russia.
то, что если не будут предприниматься превентивные действия, направленные на поддержку нашей борьбы, чтобы свергнуть этот режим, то это может привести к тому, что Россия инкорпорирует Беларусь.
This is a challenge to our statehood for sovereignty for Belarus. If Russia doesn't achieve its goals in Ukraine, it will create an image story and sell it to its society. As one of the stories is the maximum absorption of Belarus. Lukashenko is a tricky leaf. When the critical moment comes, he may try to defect and turn to Europe.
Он тот человек, который может в этот момент переметнуться и прыгнуть, попытаться прыгнуть, не знаю, там, в объятия Европы.
No one will give him a hug, but he can actively try to knock. But in order for Europe to react to this, he will have to do very clear actions. The first is to release all political prisoners, stop repression, and stop helping Russia in its war against Ukraine. Hybrid warfare against EU countries he must stop. If he does, his subjectivity and intentions to maintain independence become real, and then Europe could theoretically help. But before this situation comes, Lukashenko is already feeling the threat. We'll have to watch the situation unfold. I'm under the assumption that he needs to be cornered. We need to limit his options and create conditions so that he is forced to stop the repression, release everyone, and stop helping Russia in the war in Ukraine. Yes, it's difficult, but it will be up to him to decide whether he stays in power. How did Belarus increase supplies to Russia due to rapprochement with Russia and Western sanctions? Analysts note that Belarus GDP grew by 4% in 2024, which is positive, but due to the dependence on the Russian economy, sanctions against Russia also make it difficult for Belarus.
Так как Беларусь стала безумно зависима от российской экономики, санкции против России отражаются и на Беларуси, насколько я понимаю.
They say that it affects the exchange rate. I wonder how the Belarusian economy will develop against the background of new sanctions against Russia, such as the recent U.S. sanctions against Russian oil companies. We see that China, India are no longer accepting their ships. Do you think it will affect the economy of both countries, including Belarus? When the war broke out, Ukraine completely stopped trade relations with Belarus. This is about 80% of the turnover. Where did 8 to 10% of Belarusian exports go? They went to Russia, which is logical since Ukraine has stopped trading with the aggressor. Above all, the war pushed him into the arms of Russia because he chose war. He chose the aggressor's side. Sanctions policies need to be analyzed carefully to understand which sanctions work and why. As democratic forces of Belarus, we constantly raise the topic of assistance to Ukraine in all negotiations, including the recent ones in Warsaw. When the EU is devoting significant resources to supporting Ukraine in this war. The EU imposes sanctions against Russia and Lukashenko's regime, but leaves a loophole to circumvent them. This loophole is Lukashenko's regime, since Russia and Belarus form a union state and a common economic space. Goods banned to Russia get there through Belarus, thanks to the common economic space. We are for Ukraine's victory, so sanctions against Lukashenko's regime and Russia should be synchronized. That's when their maximum effect comes. I argue with Belarusian politicians who argue that lifting sanctions against Lukashenko will lead to his rapprochement with Russia. But at the same time, they say, we are for Ukraine. If you're in favor of Ukraine, then you're in favor of sanctions. Sanctions, unfortunately, are lagging. I agree with your president, who proposed preventive sanctions in 2022. In 2020, when millions were in the streets, powerful sanctions should have been imposed. The West has only imposed sanctions on 13 to 14 people without affecting the economy and Lukashenko in 2020. That's why they're always late. What the U.S. has done now is good, but unfortunately it's too late. It was a serious influence. So it's an important decision. Lukashenko is suffering from sanctions. The negative trade balance for the first 11 months of last year is $4.2 billion. There is a plus in services, but it has not been able to bring the overall trade balance into positive territory. About 660 million negative trade balance. 4% is from the 2022-2023 fall base. Belarusian exports are declining, including oil, from which Belarus is missing out on profits due to sanctions. The Russian market is shrinking. Belarus's GDP is growing because of the defense order from the Russian Ministry of Defense, as the industry works for its needs. If Russia's economy is winding down, so is the order. MADS fell by 11% in terms of sales on the Russian market. This is a serious blow to MAZ. Russia's economic problems are automatically transferred to Belarus. Today, Lukashenko has two problems. The first is demography. Many Belarusians left the country. In Poland, according to the Minister of Education, 31,000 children study in schools and kindergartens. 31,000 children have left Belarus, as well as 15,000 IT workers, according to Beer Partizan members. The second problem is capital flight. Investments are being cut back. And I don't think he's going to solve them anytime soon. I agree with you and believe that we will wait for independent elections in Belarus, and we will not see Lukashenko in power again. I want to thank you for the analytics. We spoke with Pavel Latushko, Deputy Head of the Transitional Cabinet of Belarus.